Okay, Happy New Year, Dad.
Happy New Year.
Did you go crazy last night?
No, I just went to sleep. I think I heard some
Yeah.
fireworks like at 12:20 in the morning.
Do you shake
That-
your fists like an angry old man and yell?
yeah, I opened the window and yeah, and
Okay,
cursed them.
good. All right, well, today is the new year, January 1st, 2025, Wednesday. Um, and I know a lot of channels have been doing this, but I think we can do it as well. Is just to give a little summary over the year. So much has happened in the past year. And I
Yeah,
think maybe it's kind of a good time to step back now and take a look and summarize the major events and just kind of the everything that's happened in the course of things.
uh-huh.
I mean, personally, for me, it seems like it was such an eventful year,
Yeah.
2024, but it's also the year that I started talking to you a lot about these topics. So I
Yeah,
maybe,
we've had a string of eventful years. I think there's no question about it. Um, it seems like ever since maybe 2016 when Donald Trump was elected the first time. We just had a, it's kind of like I don't know, the Pandora's box was open and it's just been one thing after another. Yeah, I think you're right. 2024 was particularly eventful, especially the second half of it. There's a lot of, really quite extraordinary events took place. I'm just thinking about, the attempted assassination, the Kursk invasion, um, the fall of Syria, the decapitation of Hezbollah, the pager attack, um, and none of those are events that anybody could have foreseen.
the
Other than a very
Reshnik.
yeah, the Oreshnik. That's right. That's another one I meant. Except for people that were have very, very limited communities of people. Obviously the public had no way of knowing what was going to happen in any of these events, and some of them are, really major events that are, going to have repercussions for many years, if not decades to come. Like the fall of Syria in particular.
Hmm. So what do you see coming up for 2025? Or is there anything in particular you wanted to
Well,
recap from
sure.
2024?
Okay. Well, I just I pointed out these events, these major events that occurred during the second half of 2024, and again, we had no way of anticipating them. They each one was a surprise, and so that tells us there are going to be surprises in 2025, and it's a fool's errand to try to pretend you can map out. There are certain trends that I think that are very important and will continue to hold, and I think the general military trend will. I mean, I was looking back at 2024, and it began with really Avdiivka. I think that was a very, very significant event. That was the fortress city, very close to Donetsk city, and it fell. It took a while. It fell in February. I think the fighting started in the early fall of the previous year, but it fell. And when that really changed the whole complexion of the war. After that, the Russians began to advance at an increasing rate, and that trend has continued all the way through, the end of 2024. Um, so that is actually one of the biggest news stories. It's just that this 2024, in 2024, we saw the Russians break through the highly fortified lines that the Ukrainians had built up over the course of a good decade, starting in 2014. Avdiivka, Marinka slightly earlier. I think it was December of 2023. So Marinka, Avdiivka, um, Krasnogorovka, um, Selidova, and now just Kurakov. That's another one that just fell. And then there's, oh God, why is the name escaping me right now? Is that little fortress city that held for a long time?
Bakhmut?
No, not
No.
Bakhmut. That's previous. That's earlier.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, but it doesn't matter. Okay. It's
Mm.
just the main thing is that these fortress cities fell. All of them have. And, they're nearly all of them. There's still Touretsk. There's still Chasiv, but they're about 80 to 90% under Russian control, and they will fall soon. And that's it. I mean, that's after those fall. There's that battle, that chapter comes to an end. The Russians have broken through. This probably the most fortified, most can say fortified belt of land on the earth, and past these, once they get past these cities, there really isn't anything. There just aren't the fortifications. There isn't the kind of terrain or cities that really lend themselves to being fortified either. I mean, those cities were all industrial, or some of them small cities, towns, but they were highly industrial. They had coal mines, and they had power plants and factories, and those actually, and high-rise buildings, and all of those lend themselves to defense. Something that you could convert all of those structures into fortifications, and that's what the Ukrainians had done, and but that has been defeated, overcome by the Russians, and what we see after that is really just open country, towns, that again don't have these industrial facilities, level country. Another thing is that area had quite a few waterways and reservoirs and so on and so forth, and we just don't see that. Once we get past them, it's open, it's flat, and relatively free of obstacles all the way to the Dnieper River. So I think you can make a prediction here that there is going to be a real a much swifter advance. Again, I'm not expecting a blitzkrieg, unless the Russians actually go for a big aero offensive, but they've just shown a reluctance to do that. That's when I've been expecting them to do that, and others have too. And so far they haven't. But they may, at some point surprise us and really make a big effort to punch through. And maybe they were just waiting to get through all these fortifications. We'll see. But even in the absence of a big aero offensive, I think there's going to be a march to the Dnieper, and I think we'll see them reach the Dnieper, by the end of this year at least. And it may be faster, maybe by the middle or the end of the summer or something like that. So we will see a real acceleration. Yeah, I just looking back on the nearly 3 years of conflict here. You can see there are very distinct chapters. We had going back in 2022 was the first, approximately 3 months or so, really the first month or two where the Russians, launched their invasion or incursion into Ukraine, and that was, it was costly for the Russians, but they did actually take a lot of territory. And the reason they did is because many of these governors were actually happy to join the Russians. So that's what we've found in like southern Ukraine, in Zaporozhye region, and in Kherson, or I should say administrators. And then but that, I remember when that happened, I think like a lot of us, I was really quite confused at what was going on. First of all, I didn't expect the Russians to go in at all, even though there were all these predictions, because I just come to poo-poo everything that the Western media said. In this case, they were right. Obviously it happens. So we always have to keep that in mind. Occasionally, they speak the truth. There was, but the way they characterized it was false. That there was that the Russians were trying to, we're going to try to capture Kiev and all of Ukraine. It was a huge land grab, and it wasn't a land grab. What we learned, was that it was actually an effort to bring the Ukrainians to the negotiating table. And it succeeded. Like, I think the day after it began, they began negotiations. And of course, we got the draft agreement. We won't go into detail on that. But that's what that first phase of the fighting was about. But that failed because, of course, the agreement was torn up, under pressure from the British and the Americans. And then the Russians found themselves there actually greatly undermanned because it wasn't a land grab. They didn't send in enough soldiers to hold a large amount of land, and that's when we got that surprise attack by the Ukrainians on Kharkov, and they were able to take back almost all of Kharkov, and then of course, that was followed by the retreat by the Russians from Kherson. They just didn't have the manpower. So, that was kind of a second phase of the fighting. In the midst of that, there were some real successes. Of course, the Russians took Mariupol, and Mariupol ever since has been undergoing repairs, and apparently it's really a city that's coming back to life, and greatly damaged because there was very heavy fighting in Mariupol. But that's a reason to hope for the future. Here's it's one of these cities that very much battle scarred, much of it destroyed, but it's coming back, and everybody's seeing that. And apparently, a lot of former Ukrainian citizens who fled the city at the beginning of the attack or the fighting in Mariupol have now returned and are settling down there in their new apartments. But then we enter, into the next phase. Okay, let's say that after the retreat from Kherson and the defeat, you have to say, it was very lightly manned, but they weren't able to hold the line clearly in Kharkov. The Russians started to mobilize 300,000 reservists and started to build up their army. But they didn't immediately go on the offense, with the one exception of Bakhmut, and that's where the Bakhmut phase began. And that was, of course, Prigozhin and the Wagner group. And that's, it was just that one city, which is, it wasn't too terribly important, but it clearly wasn't unimportant. It was a city of strategic significance. But I think it played an important role in the course of events, because it was in Bakhmut that the Russians just chewed up so much of the Ukrainian army. I think I talked earlier about how Ukraine has actually gone through several armies, but there was a whole army that was pretty much chewed up in Bakhmut. Now, that it's true that Wagner also suffered heavy casualties. If you look at Media Zona's tracking of deaths on the Russian side, there is a definite, a large spike at Bakhmut. You see one at the very beginning, when the Russians first entered. And then you see another one at Bachmut. It's really quite high. It may have been the highest of the whole conflict, but it did have the effect of just chewing up an entire Ukrainian army. Because as Zelensky has done it again and again, he made a point of making a stand. He even made a statement in the U.S. Congress: Bakhmut will not fall, and of course it did, and it fell at great, great cost. And there were, voices within Ukraine and also in the West, like in the Pentagon, saying, this is, don't do it. You're just wasting all your, your men and equipment on this battle. It's just not worth it. Because already the plans were being drawn up for the great summer offensive of 2023. Now, in general, it's called a counteroffensive. I think that's actually kind of a misuse of the term of a counteroffensive. So, like Alexander McCurris or some others, we'll just say, Mark Sloboda is another example, is prefer to use the term the summer offensive of 2023. So plans were already being drawn up, but because of Bakhmut, I think in part, that army was not ever as strong as they hoped that it would be. But it was, they threw all kinds of equipment, and 2023 was really about, the first part of 2023 was Bakhmut. That ended in May. And then shortly thereafter, the summer offensive began. And that, again, the Russians were just on the defense, but it was a very successful defense. They completely defeated this offensive. And that was at the end of 2023, we saw the Russians beginning to go on the offense. And first it was very slow. It was Marinka, and then earlier this year it was Avdiivka, and everything we've seen. So really the whole complexion of the war has changed quite a bit. We kind of gotten used to what's happened in 2024. We're used to these Russian advances, but it's important to remember that was not how the war was, what was happening in the war earlier. The Russians were on the defense, or they just were fighting in one place in Bakhmut. Now they're making advances all along the line, or at several different points on the line. And they're advancing significantly faster than they did before. It still has to be said that if you kind of get a like a satellite view. You go way back and you look at Ukraine. It's hard to see what's happening. The importance again is that these are the most highly fortified areas. So I believe, now that they really are coming through to the end of these fortifications, we're going to see significantly more rapid advances in 2025.
Right, and also, we never mentioned the fact that Trump is going to be inaugurated soon. Do you think that's going to have a large impact in wrapping up this war, this conflict?
I don't think so. I'll be honest. I know that he has. I think he has a sincere, desire to end the conflict. But he is so far from meeting the Russians' basic conditions, and he does seem to just doesn't really seem to understand again, the situation. It seems like he believes too much of what he watches on Fox News, or and maybe that's being echoed by the people that are. I think it is being echoed by a lot of the people that are advising him. I don't think, there will be an attempt at negotiations, but it just won't go anywhere. Now, I think the best thing we can hope for, and this is something, which is important, is that he could, for like I've said several times, he could simply lift the restrictions, or rather reimpose the restrictions on the missiles. And that could bring, and in that way de-escalate and reduce the chance of a serious escalation, leading to a wider conflict. And that's important. But I don't see a negotiated settlement. So I think the war will continue as it has. Now, he's made noises about just not supporting Ukraine. And I don't think he really wants to. And a number of the Republicans don't want to. They consider it a waste of money. But he also, I'm sure, has a real fear of having Ukraine's defeat pinned on him. And, this is typical of presidents. They don't want to be the one that pulls the plug, and, just like what happened to Biden in Afghanistan, right? And the U.S. needed to exit Afghanistan. In fact, it was a process that was begun under Trump. But you don't want to have it to happen on your watch. It just looks bad. And of course, I think there was some additional incompetence there that made it look even worse than it had to look. But no matter what, it's not going to look good. And your opponents are going to say, you're weak, you lost the war. And Trump doesn't want that to happen. So there's that logic that I think is going to force him to continue to provide arms, munitions. But the problem is their ability to is really very limited. And we've already seen that. I think, we've gone through the stockpiles, and now we're just drawing for monthly production, and it just isn't enough.
Right.
That's clear. Right.
He can't freeze the conflict if that's what he wants. So it doesn't make any sense. It's going to end under his term, no matter what. It's much better to have it.
Most likely, yeah.
And at the negotiating table rather than on the battlefield, right? That looks a lot worse if you have to have a complete surrender or complete military defeat of Ukraine. I think that's a lot worse. Whereas if you negotiate it and you're able to speak to the American people and to the West and say why this is good for the world to end this conflict at the negotiating table, he could be up for the Nobel Peace Prize for any conflicts like this, right?
Well, he wouldn't. No, he wouldn't be. I'm sorry, Trump will never get the Nobel Peace Prize because the people on that committee hate Trump. And remember, these are the people that gave Obama the Nobel Peace Prize like 2 months into his first term, which is just absurd. He hadn't done anything. They just gave him a peace prize for being Obama. It's just not going to happen. And I'm sure there are probably a bunch of globalists, and they would think it was awful that a peace was drawn up that met Russian conditions. I think this. Let me just say this very quickly. It's to kind of put this all in perspective. The Americans, the way they talk about this, like they're sort of an outside party and a superior party, and they're going to go in and impose these conditions, and the Russians will have to accept it, and the Ukrainians will have to accept it, and that'll be it. But that is just a fundamental mischaracterization of the situation. I mean, we are a party to the conflict, first of all, quite clearly, very much so. Indirectly, through support, but even directly in the case of those missiles. And not only are we a party to the conflict, we're a party to the losing side. And there's just no awareness of that on our side, on the Western side. No awareness of that in Trump's words or that of Kellogg or these other people in the upcoming administration. There's just this assumption of superiority, this assumption that they'll have to accept this. We'll be able to turn the screws on them and apply the carrots and sticks. And you say, no, you're a party to the losing side. That's something you got to understand.
Right. I sometimes I get a little confused when I think about going to the negotiating table. First of all, how much involvement will Ukraine even have at the negotiating table? Because it sounds like when we talk about negotiations, it sounds like it's the U.S. negotiating with Russia, which makes it clear that this is the U.S. versus Russia. That this is not about Ukraine's democracy or whatever it is that they're trying to feed Western media. And then I'm just wondering, why does the U.S. care so much? How much, if the Donbass stays part of Russia? If they have a referendum or whatever it is, and they say negotiate, okay, Russia, because it's clear Russia is not giving away these 4 oblasts, that are in eastern Ukraine. This is going to be part of Russia. Why does Trump care so much? Is it just the image of victory and being a good negotiator? What are we negotiating for? What's our interest in making sure that this conflict continues, or that somehow we retake Zaporozhye or Donbass? I don't get it. What's our position? Why do we want these? Why do we want the Zelensky Kiev regime to regain these territories? It doesn't make sense to me.
In the end, I don't think it really matters, the territories themselves. It's just what they symbolize, to the extent that if we give them or we concede them to the Russians, the problem is that it's a concession, and that we admitted that the Russians are a formidable force. And it's something that it seems like we cannot admit. And it's just like, again, we discussed many times, there's a kind of perception that of Russia that developed during the 90s, when Russia was in chaos and was weak, and that perception just hasn't left us. It's something that it seemed like we're desperate to maintain. It's almost as if the way that, again, we talk about in negotiations, it's just that, okay, well, we'll lay down the law and the Russians will accept. Because back in the 90s, that's how things worked. The Russians didn't like a lot of the things we did, but they just had to accept it. And it's almost like we think that the Russians, the problem is that they're not acting the way they're supposed to. They're supposed to be acting like they did in the 90s. And they've got this kind of this momentary sort of fit of let's say, insanity, where they think they actually have real power and they can do what they want. And they'll wake up and they'll realize that they're the same old, pathetic has-been that they were in the 90s, and they'll just accede to our terms. And it almost seems like that's the idea that we have. Otherwise, how do you explain the approach? But it, clearly it isn't going to work. It's just not. And we don't. It just seems like that's the main stumbling block, is that we can't treat them as equals. We can't treat them as a rival that has its own interests that need to be respected in that part of the world. That if we did, this war never. If we had earlier, the war never would have happened. Of course, it's just that we refuse because. Again, acceding to their demands, actually negotiating in good faith, is to admit that, okay, they're actually, not just like an errant child that can be disciplined. That's so often the language that we use: malign Russian behavior, that, and we penalize them with economic sanctions or whatever. But no, they're a power in their own right. Okay, they have to. And their interests, their concerns have to be addressed and have to be worked out. But we had made a decision, I think, starting back in the 90s, that we couldn't do that. We used to, it's different. We treated the Soviet Union very differently. And what the Russians are hoping is that the West will start treating them like they treated the Soviet Union, as a force that needs to be respected, even feared a little bit, not simply lectured and penalized. But we just can't seem to get out of that mindset.
But you don't think that with Trump coming in that we can have a new mindset? I mean, there's clearly people in Trump's camp like RFK Jr., Tucker Carlson interviewed Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin. I think J.D. Vance also has a better understanding of the conflict. So don't you think that fresh impression can come to the mindset that, hey, because what you're saying to me is like, oh, we just have to maintain this idea that we are completely dominant and we cannot accept a powerful Russia. So what, we're just going to continue this until we go to nuclear war, or that the West completely collapses? Because it's becoming
it doesn't have to go that far,
but at some point it has to break, right? We have to, like you said, Russia will win in Ukraine. It's inevitable. So that's what's going to happen. And if we refuse to negotiate and recognize Russia as a power, and we have to go in there and dictate and say, no, we won't let this happen, that Russia can't have these 4 oblasts, we're going to keep, then what's the outcome? I mean, we have to negotiate or Russia's going to keep advancing. There's nothing we can do about that, right?
Right. Yeah, well, we don't have to negotiate. We should. I mean, in our interests, but, and above all, in the interests of Ukraine.
But why are we even negotiating? It shouldn't. This is between. This shouldn't be. Well, this shouldn't have anything to do with us.
Yeah. Well, the problem is, it does have a lot to do with us. The Ukraine is still in the fight because of us, of course, and we were the ones too that, along with the British, that urged them to tear up the Istanbul Agreement. So we, in a lot of ways, we just own this mess. We made it, and then we've got to clean it up. And also, and in the meantime, too,
But you're saying we won't clean it up. You're just saying that.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, I say we won't. You pointed to these people that seem to have a better understanding, and I agree they have, but I don't know how much better. It's if you look at a lot of things that, like maybe J.D. Vance or some of the others say, I think the one exception, the one who maybe understands things thoroughly, might be RFK.
You don't think Tucker Carlson does? I mean, think
Tucker Carlson. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think he probably does. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. There are, but a lot of them, it's just sort of like the attitude, and I think you find this among many in the Republican Party, is that we should be focusing on China and the Middle East, right? It's not so much they still have the same attitudes of Russian weakness and so they do have this belief that they can kind of just steamroll the Russians. It's just a matter of giving the Russians an off-ramp, which they're desperate for. And you'll get this, there are so many articles that come out. It's just it's every other day. And it always suggests that the Russians are, on the verge of collapse. They're exhausted. They've made some progress, but they're looking... but they can't go much further. And if we just allow them to hold on to what they've had for a while, and of course we'll try to build up forces on the Kiev side, that they'll go for it. And that's just absurd. But that seems to be out there, and it seems to be what Trump himself, from the way he's talked. Occasionally he says something where it sounds like he's maybe just recently been talking to somebody else, but usually the way he talks is very much consistent with that consensus. And if you have that kind of thinking, you're just not going to go anywhere with negotiations. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, but I mean, I think Trump says he wants to talk to Putin, right? I mean, it's clear that he's not afraid to talk to other leaders. He talked to Kim Jong-un, and I think that's one of his greatest qualities. And plus the fact that he just wants to be liked by everyone, including people like Putin. So, I mean, I think if he talks to Putin, surely there'll be some type of educational experience, and maybe he can start to go down the rabbit hole like we have and be like, whoa, everything I've been told was a lie.
I'd like to, yeah. Right. Well, yeah. Again, it's good that they talk, and it may be just like the beginning. I just don't think it's possible, even if, let's say, it really dawns on his administration, the Russians are serious, and maybe that's what they'll find out with these talks, and they're winning, and there's really nothing we can do about it. I think they'll make the political decision but we can't give it all to them. They're going to skewer us alive in the media. The Democrats we're going to be, all of us are going to be accused of being Putin's puppets. Say that, oh yeah, Putin did really work some magic on Trump and is now, because there's still people out there, a lot of them, who think that Trump is a sort of Manchurian candidate. Remember that he actually is,
Putin put him in power, and
essentially Putin put him in power, and there are a lot of people, people that truly believe that are a minority, but they exist. But then there are a lot of people who just have still these kind of lingering, I think, inchoate suspicions about Trump. And if he does something like that, where he actually, again, it would be very sensible and it would be for the good of Ukraine. And it would actually, right, it would, if he agreed to those terms, he'd probably save Odessa for Ukraine and the whole Black Sea seacoast for Ukraine. It could be a huge benefit to Ukraine. But I don't think he can do it, even if at some point he realizes that's what he needs to do. I don't think he's reached that point where he understands that he needs to do that. But if he does, I think he'll just find that it's politically just impossible to do that in the current environment here. That's
right. You were saying that the only way that it could be politically possible is if Russia does some type of aerial offensive, makes some huge advance, marches straight to the Dnieper before Trump gets inaugurated. Then it makes it easier to say for Trump to walk away, because they can say it's clear that this war is over. This is all Biden's fault. It collapsed at the end of Biden's term. But if it doesn't happen, then you think that it's highly likely that this will just kind of drag on a bit longer, and just Russia will just continue until it gets a complete military victory. Maybe they march all the way to Kiev.
It's possible. We'll see. Actually, there's kind of a moment of truth that's not in the not so distant future. It's just that the Russians are actually coming to the far western boundary of Donetsk, of the Donetsk Oblast, and after that is Dnipropetrovsk. That's the next oblast, which goes all the way to the Dnieper. And they've said that they're going to take, again, of course, all of Donetsk, all of Zaporozhye, all of Kherson. But as things stand, they have not declared that intention for Dnipropetrovsk. So we'll see. I mean, there's a chance that they'll just stop when they get there. I don't know. But I think it's probably more likely that they will continue to move. And then as they go farther and farther, they go all the way to the Dnieper, then it becomes highly unlikely, in the absence of any kind of negotiated settlement, that they're actually going to give up that land. So that's, we'll see that pretty soon.
Do you think that the Russians even want a negotiated settlement at this point? I mean, if there is, there's some agreement, and then the thing is, NATO will still be there. This idea of building up the forces. Yeah. Maybe they agree to neutrality, but it seems like the NATO's word or the United States word doesn't mean much. And I think the Russians know that every single time there's an agreement, we just go back on it within. Yeah. We just said, that was just a ruse. We were just tricking the Russians.
Right. Yeah, we've actually boasted about how we fooled the Russians.
Right. So
and that goes all the way back to the initial promises not to have made to Gorbachev by Secretary of State Baker and others, many, like the West German foreign minister, many Western leaders. It's not just that Baker mumbled a few words to him. It was a promise made again and again. We're not going to expand eastward. And then on that basis, Gorbachev allowed the reunification of Germany and withdrew the troops, from the Warsaw countries. And then, we just broke the agreement.
Right. So it's been over 30 years of just lies.
Yeah. And that's right. That's just right. Exactly. That's just one of many instances. And of course, the most recent, we've talked about the Minsk Accords. And we have those the leaders that were involved in those negotiations, above all Angela Merkel. She's come out at least twice and just said, "Oh yeah, we never really intended to keep that. It was a chance to buy time to build up which just strikes me as extraordinary. I mean, it's just really, essentially, it's a statement. You're telling the Russians Yeah, that we just, that we cannot be trusted. You're just announcing to them that, we don't keep agreements and you're bragging about it.
Right, to say
So
it
the Russians are
publicly.
looking at that and so you're right. I think they probably don't even want to get into negotiations because they've been burned so many times that they're just not going to, don't have any reason to trust that. It forces them. The only thing they can trust is their own power. That's what they've learned. And it's been a hard lesson. It's so very clear. That was really not Putin's way. He did not want to go down that road. Even with the beginning, we talked about, we went through the phases. The initial phase of the war was not about grabbing land. Remember that Istanbul agreement said that, okay, we'll withdraw from all these places. And he was going to give it all up. It wasn't a land grab. But now he's forced to make it a land grab. He's forced to take the land because he's learned, I think, rather slowly. And a lot of people think that he's really been very naive. And he's admitted that to himself, that he's been naive. He's learned that you simply can't trust him. You can't trust the West. And so, therefore, the only thing they actually do understand, they don't even seem to understand that very well, but maybe the only thing they do understand is power. And at some point, they'll just recognize Russian power and accept what's happened.
Right. I think maybe the Russians are coming to the realization that NATO, the supposed defensive alliance, has one objective, and that's to destroy Russia. And it's to keep moving towards Russia, to expand, to break up the Russian Empire. And
Yeah.
so in their mind, they might say, well, this war, this conflict in Ukraine has done more to destroy NATO and the U.S. empire than anything else, since the fall of the Soviet Union. So that we want this to continue. The longer this goes on, the more the U.S. is weakened militarily, and its weakness is exposed. More money gets thrown down the drain, or economically we're being degraded, especially Europe. It's going to cause Europeans to eventually, I believe, at some point, turn against the U.S. empire. And that would just cause and once that happens, we might be looking at really the dissolvement of NATO, and then this threat is disappeared, and we can enter into the new multipolar world. And that's the vision that that Putin has, is the multipolar world. So maybe we're thinking, oh, we'll negotiate, but we didn't really think about, first of all, we don't listen to what the Russians want at the negotiating table to begin with.
It's really not negotiation. It's really just, it's like dictating terms, and they're supposed to wake up and realize that there's a weaker party and submit to them.
Right.
That's just not, because they could do that. Like I've said, they did do that back in the 90s, and it just seems like they're just like Russia, you don't understand what your role is now. You're supposed to remember you were a good little boy back in the 90s, and we told you, well, we just laid down the law and you accepted it. Now you're not doing that. Wake up. Be a good little Russia again.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, I mean, even if we would say something like, we'll agree to, that Russia can maintain these 4 oblasts and agree to neutrality for Ukraine and no NATO ever for Ukraine, Russia might just say, no, we don't believe you, first of all.
That's a real problem. It really is. And
right. So maybe
actually
negotiations.
Looking at it, it's like, how can they? I mean, it's not just, it's the same thing, actually, vis-a-vis Iran. And like the JCPOA, that was quite an achievement. It was reached. Russia is a party to that. The Europeans, the Americans, and of course the Iranians, and it was a result of a lot of hard work and negotiations over the course of years. But it was reached. And almost immediately afterwards, the Americans started to break some of the key provisions. They were supposed to lift sanctions. They didn't. And then, of course, Trump came into office, and then he just tore it up. Mm. So the Iranians look at that. The Russians look at all their own experience and at the Iranian experience. And they say, what's the point? What's the point?
Right. Right. Yeah, I think I just kind of convinced myself, or you convinced me, that this isn't going to end at the negotiating table. Because in my mind, it's just like, okay, great. Trump will come into power. He'll start talking to Putin. Will be dialogues. It'll be difficult to hash out the details, but once we start talking, then we'll move towards the path of
There has to be
negotiated
a
settlement.
there has to be a real awakening of some sort on the Western side. The people that run the West, the Western foreign policy, are just, I think, are incapable of making, honest agreements that they intend to keep with Russia at this time, or
Right.
Iran. And it's just going to have to be, like there has to be not necessarily a revolution, but a whole new generation of foreign policy elites, that have abandoned that idea and have woken up to the reality. And and in the absence of a revolution, that's a process that's going to take decades, really. And I think at this point they have to see a real sort of conversion or awakening on the Western side, and there's just no signs of that. And I think it's with the people who are there, it's just not possible. And so maybe 20 years from now it'll be a different world. Enough people have grown up and watched, observe the reality, and have kind of learned the lessons, and they move into these positions of power, and then maybe we can start talking again. The
20
way that
years?
We did. Yeah.
Are we going to be talking about this for 20 years?
Well, yeah, if we're still here, if they're probably, if the West still is holding together by that point. So yeah, who knows? It just may never happen. Here, who knows?
Yeah, I mean, even if there is an awakening, I'm thinking that we're not looking at this enough from the Russian point of view. Like we said, they've been burnt too many times. Even if we say, yeah, we'll agree to everything, I think Russia might just be like, you know what, we're done. We're just going to keep going, and then NATO will just begin to self-implode. I think once they get really desperate, if they're like, oh, we got to conscript, get people, and then all of a sudden we might see revolutions. The French will start saying like, no, I'm not going over there. The Italians are already kind of bowing out, like you're saying, and then you're just going to have all this discontent and tension within the European Union that I think might just start to break it apart, and then we'll see what happens. I mean, it already is fracturing in many ways. I mean, just what we've seen. I mean, just Romania. I mean, you got Hungary and Slovakia.
We've spoken about that. I mean, there are these, like we said, these rising populist forces, but there is an authoritarian reaction, and so far the authoritarians have had the upper hand. Right? They've annulled elections. They've especially played these games to keep the winning parties out of power. And there is even, reasons to fear for Viktor Orban's future. And I think also Fico's future too. In Slovakia. Again, these are small countries. They belong to the European Union, and the European Union, has a lot of different levers that they can apply, and you can be sure that they're working overtime. In fact, it's been said. I think it was quite openly. I can't remember which official, but a very high-ranking official in the European Commission just said essentially we're going to get rid of Orban, and they've already selected his replacement. And they'll work hard. He's obviously a popular and very crafty politician, and he may survive it. But it's going to be a difficult fight. And it's just, one thing, like what we saw happen very, very recently was just today, of course, the cutoff of the oil. We talked about that last time.
The gas.
It stopped. Yeah, or rather, exactly, the gas. It's the gas pipeline, the Druzhba pipeline. The flow has been cut. And that's really going to hurt, both Orban and Fico. Because, one thing is that they could point to their success. We have a buoyant economy. Our economies are doing better than the rest of Europe. And it's partly because they were getting this cheap gas. And they've lost that. And now people should understand, okay, that's not their fault. It's the EU. Maybe we should even reconsider being part of the EU. But these little countries really are at a disadvantage. I mean, the EU just can buy them off. Can subsidize can use a combination of carrots and sticks, fiscal carrots and sticks to really shape public opinion in these countries. And one thing they did, I think, it's not actually clear who initiated this, whether it was Zelensky or it was the Europeans pressuring Zelensky to cut off the flow of gas, because they both, Zelensky is going way back, has been cutting economic relations with Russia, even when it was to the detriment of the Ukrainian economy. It's probably both of them. They agreed, yeah, this is a good thing to do. And if it especially hurts Slovakia and Hungary, all the better. So even, these are the kind of the most obvious, the two countries where the dissidents are in charge, but their positions are not all that secure. I mean, they're very precarious. So, yeah, I would like to hope that eventually all these obviously corrupt, increasingly authoritarian globalist regimes will be swept from power. But I don't think we can count on it. They've shown that they've got still a lot of power and a lot of ways of holding on to power.
Well, this cutoff of the gas, it's not targeting necessarily Slovakia and Hungary, right? It's going to be affecting all of Europe, or is it disproportionately affecting them?
Yeah, it disproportionately affects them. That's the thing, because they were the ones that are purchasing that gas from the Druzhba pipeline. I think there's a separate issue with Moldova, and the problem with Moldova was that it wasn't paying Gazprom, and I guess it had accumulated a debt of something like 700 million, and so Gazprom said, okay, well, forget it. We're not, as of January 1st, we're not supplying you gas. So it is gas that they purchase, but of course, when it's going to affect the entire European market. It already has, like the future prices of gas. When this news came out, the future price of gas for gas throughout Europe rose sharply, and it will continue to rise because it just reduces the overall supply of gas within Europe. But at most, like you say, disproportionately affects those two countries.
Okay, well, I think there's likely also that if they do try to depose Orban or Fico, that it would likely backfire. I feel like people are beginning to see through these things. I mean, we saw the Georgian color revolution fail, and I think people are catching wise. And the more that the empire continues to try to do these things, I think that the more and more people are going to wake up. There might be a dark period for a little while, like they prevent, don't know how to pronounce this guy, the Romanian guy, Gorgasco or whatever.
Gorgasco,
yeah.
I think, I don't really know how to pronounce it either.
Right. They may say you're just banned, but I think people are starting to see this and to be like, what type of democracy is the West represent now? It's like,
again, it's just, that's true. I mean, they become so blatant. They used to be very subtle. It's sort of, again, similar to the process that we've seen in Israel, where, prior to October 7th, the Israelis were very good at boiling the frog, meaning that they every day they took something from the Palestinians. Again, we saw that personally. But they did it slowly enough that it wasn't a news story. We took this olive grove, we took this well. Okay, we maybe bulldozed these houses. And occasionally there would be a little, small news item in the West, but in general, it's just not noticed. And, so they were in the process of creating Greater Israel slowly at a rate which was just stayed below the radar. But after October 7th, obviously, the process accelerated. And for anybody who's paying any attention, again, there are people that are just so completely brainwashed by the Zionists. It doesn't matter. They're just cheering them on. But a lot of people that were maybe kind of aware that maybe there was some sort of problem, like my friend in Portugal, they finally really saw what was going on. The mask was off of Israel. And I think the same thing is happening in Europe in a way. There has obviously been this increasing authoritarian, anti-democratic trend, this redefinition of democracy from being, actually ruled by the people to to rule by certain elites, and you have to adopt certain policies, whatever. Otherwise, you're not a Democrat. So if the wrong side wins, that's a blow to democracy. We're seeing that kind of language both in the U.S. and in Europe. I think that trend probably goes back decades, but it's in just these recent years, and especially this last year, where the mask truly came off in places like Georgia and Moldova and Romania. And yeah, it's a lot of people just won't want to see it, or they don't care because they've actually converted to the new way of thinking. Just like some Zionists really don't care that they're committing a giant genocide because they really believe that these are subhumans and whatever.
We're God's chosen people.
Yeah, but in Europe, there are a lot of people who obviously really don't care about democracy, and if the majority is silenced, well, they have the wrong opinions, and that's the way they think. But that is a change. It used to be a lot of people, I think, really believe that that's what we're all about, actually ruled by the people. And it's hard to believe that anymore, right? Especially after 2024.
Right. And I'll talk a little bit about, you talking about the mask falling off of Israel, and just sort of the Zionist grip on the U.S., especially the conservative U.S. population. I think what October 7th did is, the Republicans, the conservatives in the United States are traditionally very, very Zionist. But we are seeing...
Yeah, if you go way back, that's really not so true. Like you go back to the 60s and early 70s, you found as many critics of Israel on the Republican side as you found on the Democrat side, maybe even more. But now it's certainly true, during these last couple of
just
decades.
From what I've seen, just since the growing up here in the Bible Belt, it's really Christian Zionism is a very powerful force, and the conservatives sort of really embraced this, at least recently. But we are seeing a change, a general trend, and I'm wondering how this is going to play out. Because we have people, for example, like Candace Owens is a prominent conservative commentator, and she won Anti-Semite of the Year. She's a very prominent critic of Israel. And we have people like Tucker Carlson, that is part of the MAGA movement that interviewed Jeffrey Sachs, for example. And that interview with Jeffrey...
He also interviewed that Palestinian Lutheran pastor.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that was a very important interview.
Right, and so this is viewed by millions of conservatives. And so I think that's I think hugely significant. I wonder how that will impact U.S. support for Israel, and do you think that the grip that the Zionists have on the U.S. is still ironclad, or have you seen it greatly weakened? And just the trend is going to be
right. Well, I think it has to be said that again that most of the dissent, the most of the awakening, let's say, as to what Israel really is, has taken place on the left. There's no question about it. The Democratic Party remains firmly in control of the Zionists, but the younger Democrats are trending away in a significant way, from Zionism. And so that is hugely significant. At present, there's no signs of, let's say, of Zionism being overthrown in either party. But the long-term trend, especially on the Democratic side, it has got to be rather frightening for Zionists. And I think you can see that. I think some of these organizations like the ADL and AIPAC are very worried about what's happening there. But for the next few years, they should be fine. Maybe the next, who knows what happens in Israel. I'm not going to make any predictions about the future. On the conservative side, there are some, interesting developments, important, let's say, fractures, but the truth is there's still just a very small minority. You never know when, and again, it's just like, it's the support for Israel is really intense. It's not, sometimes you have, you look at an opinion poll and you see 80% of the people think this way or that way, and there's just a minority, 5%. But that 5% is very passionate about what they believe, and they really know what they believe. And the other 80% are just believing something according to habit. I mean, it's like there's really and when the push comes to shove, that 80% collapses and they get converted, and that happens. But unfortunately, I don't see that happening in the case of Zionism, because we have a very passionate majority, pro-Zionist majority in this country. It may not last forever. Again, there are people that are working at the edges, but they're on the edges, let's be honest, on the fringes.
I feel like you're a real half-class empty kind of guy, Dan.
I think I'm just being a realist. That's all. I mean, really.
Yeah,
I guess partly because I've been kind of optimistic about previous candidates going back decades, and I always see usually my hopes are always disappointed, to be honest. So
yeah, well, you've been right on most of these things. I'm usually the half glass full optimist, like, all right, real change is coming, and then nothing happens. So I think that's just the victim of being youthful. You have optimism.
Yeah, well,
I haven't had time wearing me down.
yeah. Well, occasionally, I can't say it can't happen. Again, there is more opposition to Israel. I mean, like the polls show it on the Democratic side of the ledger, especially. It's just that I think it's a majority of people are critical of Israel and think that we should stop our support. And you would never see anything like that, even just a couple of years ago. So something has changed, and that is significant. It really could have. It's not, you're just not seeing it within the establishment. It's not being reflected. And the problem is because of really, it's Zionist money. It's AIPAC, it's the Adelson family, it's the ADL, it's these organizations and the money at the top that are just keeping, have allowed Zionism to become entrenched and defending it from any kind of threat from below. But at some point they may not be able to, if the sentiment against Israel grows strong enough, we may start to see AIPAC, for example, lose its grip, and that would be wonderful. That's a real possibility. I'll be honest. Okay, I'm not predicting that, but I wouldn't be surprised if we started to see some real inroads made into Zionist control, especially on the side of the Democrats.
Right. Well, maybe we won't see sort of a dismantling of Zionism in the United States, but at the end of the day, I think what's really going to bring Israel down more than anything is that American support doesn't matter as much anymore. American military might is not all powerful anymore. It's actually showing that it can't do a lot. I mean, look, we haven't been able to beat the Houthis. The Houthis are, just embarrassing us in the Red Sea. The Houthis I hear that they've sent hypersonic missiles. Do you know if they used a hypersonic? Do you know what's going on?
I've heard that it's been claimed. I just haven't seen that verified. And maybe, the definition of a hypersonic missile, it's actually, I don't understand it entirely. It's not a missile. Some missiles attain hypersonic speeds, at least for a portion of their flight. But that does not make it a hypersonic missile. It has to be some sort of combination of maneuverability and I don't know the extent of the proportion of the flight that actually is hypersonic, and I don't know exactly where the dividing line is. So it may not be a true hypersonic missile, but it may be a missile that does attain hypersonic speed, at least at some point in its flight.
Right, which hypersonic speed is defined as anything over Mach 5, right? Mach 5 or greater. Right. It's do you know how the Houthis are that advanced? If they do have a missile that are going Mach 5, the U.S. doesn't even have this, right?
I think these missiles must be supplied by Iran. I don't think it's possible for the Houthis. I have tremendous respect for them, but they don't even have. It's like the poorest country in the world, or if not the very poorest, it's one of the poorest countries in the world, and they have been subjected to a really total war for years and years. Saudi Arabia conducted a very cruel, even genocidal war against them, with the support, active participation of the United States for many years. And so, it's a war-torn country. It's a very poor country. It just basically has no industry. I don't think there's any way that they develop these on their own. I don't see that that's possible. These missiles must be supplied by the Iranians.
Were the Saudis, were they encouraged to wage this war against Yemen before, or was this something that they wanted to do and we just kind of said, okay, go for it and we'll help you out?
Yeah, no, it was right. We weren't, I don't think, it was something that they wanted to do. It was back when the Iran-Saudi Arabia rift, was very much in effect. And the Saudis, in fact, were very upset about the Iran nuclear agreement that was reached. It was the JCPOA. And so, again, the Houthis, they're not Iranians, but they are allied, with Iran. They are a Shia sect. And at that point, Saudi Arabia just was obsessed with growing Shia power, and they saw this, this agreement that had been reached between the West and Iran as a potentially, a kind of it would allow Iran to come in from the cold. Now that never happened. Again, in large part because the U.S. Didn't implement its side of the agreement, but I think that's actually what's led to the Houthis. There was a civil war within Yemen, and the Houthis were gaining the upper hand. And this is the Saudis thought enough is enough. The Shias, the axis of resistance has grown too powerful. We got to put an end to this. So they began to wage war on Yemen.
Right, but then we had this
and we supported them. It's part because again, our relationship is partly, like you say, a compensation for, okay, yeah, you didn't want this agreement with Iran, but we will help you in your war against the Houthis.
But then there was a peace brokered by the Chinese between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So the relations, I don't know if we can call Saudi Arabia and Iran friends, but they're no longer antagonistic.
Right. No, it's been holding. It really has. It's been a success. And at the same time, Saudi Arabia called off its war on Yemen, more or less the same time, not exactly the same time.
So then, do you see some potential with Saudi Arabia? How did they feel about what's happening in Yemen now? Do you think Saudi Arabia might start to turn its back against the United States, say, like, we've had enough of you bombing the Middle East and destroying the Middle East and its support for Israel, that this could be a linchpin, that another player that would enter and say, this is enough's enough here? And that's a huge, Saudi Arabia is a huge player just on the global stage. So it has huge influence.
I don't think so. Saudi Arabia, again, they appeared to be on the verge of an agreement with Israel. We're talking about the Abraham Accords, a normalization of relations, and then October 7th happened. And so they have never, truth be told, really cared about the Palestinians or about, any Arab peoples being bombed or whatever. They're let's say they're not particularly a moral power. Now the current the Crown Prince, right, but he's very smart and he's pragmatic. That's what he is. And he is looking out for the interests of Saudi Arabia as he perceives them. He's not, so he sees it to his advantage to try to maintain kind of a more or less neutral position between the West and the BRICS countries. And that I think that's what he's going to continue to do. He would probably like to normalize relations with Israel, but he knows I don't think he really even cares about Gaza or anything, but a lot of his people do. And so he has to be careful. And I think that's why he hasn't, attempted to go ahead with the Abraham Accords again.
Okay. Well, we're over an hour, so I guess we can wrap it up here, unless there's anything else you'd want to.
No. I think we covered a lot.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, Dad. And, Happy New Year to all of our listeners. It's been You know, we're getting close to 5,000 subscribers. It's we're still a very small channel, but you know, we started from nothing just 8-9 months ago. So thank you everybody that's followed along. I know we're not great at interacting with you guys, but I see the comments, and you know, they're very heartfelt thanks to everybody that comments and supports us. So thank you very much, and happy New Year to everybody. Okay.
Happy New Year.
All right. Thank you. Bye bye.